For just a few short days, it was all quiet on the Middle Eastern front. Talks were ongoing. It seemed like we were edging closer and closer to peace, following the destruction caused by Operation Epic Fury. But if there's one thing that this war has taught us, it's that the situation can turn on a dime. Talks are off. The US is going to pull off an insane naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz as it flips the script on Iran and snatches away the regime's key piece of leverage. On April 12th, President Donald Trump turned the entire Iran war on its head. One day it seemed to be heading toward peace. Now everything has fallen apart. Trump has announced that US is going to create a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, in addition to destroying the little that is left of Iran. In the process, the targets of the US IR will be widespread. Those who have paid the tolls that Iran is charging for safe transit through the strait are going to be intercepted and presumably prevented from sailing on their way to wherever they need to go. Those are the basics, and if what we're hearing is true, that means no ships, including those from the Gulf nations that are allied to the US, are going to be making it through. This is huge, and the US has turned the tables on Iran by using its own tactics against it. However, it's also a move that threatens to have huge consequences all over the world. But before we get to that, we have to ask the question, how did we get here? Just 5 days before Trump made his incendiary declaration, the US and Iran were talking. A 2-week provisional ceasefire had been announced, and Iran said that it would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for as long as that ceasefire lasted. Pakistan had entered the fray as a mediator between the US and Iran's regime, and its last-minute intervention seemed to have prevented the US from following through on a plan to start striking Iran's power facilities and bridges as part of Operation Epic Fury. But even as the world tried to breathe a collective sigh of relief, there were challenges emerging. The 10-point plan that the US and Israel would give to Iran was one of them. 2 different versions were already circulating when the ceasefire announcement was made, and questions were being asked about whether Iran would be willing to give up the one thing that the US and Israel wants to end the war: Iran's uranium enrichment program. As it turns out, Iran's nuclear program ended up being the sticking point that derailed peace talks in the ceasefire. So there you have it, Trump declared in an April 12th Truth Social post. The meeting went well. Most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not effective immediately. The United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade ended up not being immediate, and we're going to explain what it will look like soon. But the announcement had been made. Iran was refusing to dance to America's tune, so the US is going to take the guitar and smash it over Iran's head. Trump used his post to make threats about how any Iranian who fires at the US ships entering the Strait of Hormuz would be blown to hell. And he let what's left of Iran's regime know the reason why so many of the country's former leaders are now dead is that Iran refused to give up its nuclear ambitions. In a follow-up post, Trump added that Iran had failed to follow through on its ceasefire promises, stating Iran promised to open the Strait of Hormuz, and they knowingly failed to do so. This caused anxiety, dislocation, and pain to many people and countries throughout the world. All of this may well have been the case, but there were other issues in the negotiating process that have led us to this point. Israel didn't help matters. Just hours after the US announced the ceasefire with Iran, Israel attacked Lebanon with a massive aerial blitz, but the BBC reports killed 303 people and wounded another 1,150. Israel claimed that Lebanon wasn't part of the ceasefire. Iran would have looked at that attack and known that Israel was trying to attack Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy operating in Lebanon. For Iran, that may well have meant the ceasefire had been broken almost as soon as it had started. Other issues, as reported by Time magazine, may have been that the US offer simply wasn't good enough for Iran. It reports that the US was going to propose lifting sanctions on Iran and bringing the country back into the international fold, perhaps even through a partnership of some sort with the US, as Iran saw the nuclear program issue as the main sticking point, and it may have believed that its position in the Strait of Hormuz gave it the leverage that it needed to ask for more. US Vice President J.D. Vance claims that the US made its best final offer to Iran and Pakistan But that offer, including the end of Iran's uranium enrichment program, and that Tehran's regime was unable to save face. In the end, it all comes down to pride. Iran doesn't want to be humiliated by what it sees as a total surrender by giving up its nuclear ambitions. And the US won't leave until those ambitions are squashed. So we are where we are now, knowing that the Strait of Hormuz is Iran's most important piece of leverage. The US has made the most insane move of flipping the script. With its own blockade of the strait, Trump believes that this will do the trick. They haven't left the bargaining table. I predict they come back and they give us everything we want. Trump said during an interview with Fox News, adding, "And I tell my people I want everything. I don't want 90%, I don't want 95%. I told them I want everything." A dangerous game of naval chicken is about to start. The US is going to send in warships to create a blockade that Iran had already created, using fast boats and drones. That's the big shift. Control is being taken. But here's where this gets serious. We still don't know exactly how America's blockade is going to work. What we do know is that preparation has started. The US is already sending vessels into the Strait of Hormuz, so they aren't part of the direct blockade, at least not yet. American warships are working their way through the strait on a minesweeping operation. A pair of American destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, are sailing through the strait as we speak to search for mines. Both are Arleigh Burke-class missile destroyers that come loaded with the advanced Aegis radar system, which could help them to detect and counter Iranian drones or missiles that are fired their way. It's also possible that the USS Santa Barbara and the USS Cambria will be deployed, as both carry MH-60 choppers that have the ANEES-1 airborne laser mine detection system, which should be capable of detecting mines that are closer to the surface. U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, may have also brought another type of vessel to the mine-clearing operation. In an April 12th report, the Jerusalem Post claimed that the MH-6s that the U.S. deploys may also be carrying an ASCU-23, 5 airborne mine neutralization systems. These are interesting weapons dropped into torpedo-sized tubes. These systems are expendable vehicles that the U.S. can send straight into any of the mines that it discovers. They're essentially expendable surface drones, and their job is to launch kamikaze assaults on Iranian mines. America's problem during this stage of the blockade is twofold. First, Iran is believed to have a lot of naval mines, between 2,000 and 6,000, the Jerusalem Post reports, and many of them can be laid by the small boats that Iran has been using to control the Strait of Hormuz. Those boats may have laid hundreds of mines already, though nobody knows for sure. And that leads to the second problem. The US claims that Iran has forgotten where it placed its mines. If Iran doesn't know where they are, there's no chance that the US is going to be able to get the information without a huge search and destroy operation. That sort of operation seems to be what is being launched in the strait as we speak, and America's priority appears to be to create clear pathways that it can use to get to Iran's major ports. That's what we know so far. Trump has declared that the Hormuz blockade is going to start by the time that we publish this video, and that raises questions about how the US is going to enforce its blockade. How the US tries to pull this off will change everything. And before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time. So the blockade is coming fast. On April 13th, Trump declared on Truth Social that the United States to blockade ships entering or exiting Iranian ports on April 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. In other words, the blockade is happening now. Seemingly, whether the U.S. has found and cleared the Iranian mines or not, America's challenge lies in the enforcement of its blockade, is where it may run into its biggest sticking point. First, there's what the U.S. seemingly intends to do. We know some of America's plans. All ships that are found to have paid what Trump has dubbed the illegal toll that Iran is asking of ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz are going to be intercepted. Presumably, these interceptions are going to be carried out by warships stationed near the exit of the strait. The U.S. will likely be deploying aircraft, such as its Apache helicopters and A-10 Warthogs, to fly over the strait on the lookout for any commercial ships that are trying to make their way through. The Automatic Identification System, or AIS, which transmits radio signals denoting a ship's position, will also be useful to the U.S. here. assuming that the vessels paying tolls to Iran keep their AIS on, that covers the exit to the Strait of Hormuz. But what about the strait itself? The BBC says that the U.S. Navy Commander's Handbook on Naval Operations, law which was written in 2022, defines what the U.S. is going to try to do with its blockade. That handbook defines a naval blockade as a belligerent operation to prevent vessels and/or aircraft of each states, enemy and neutral, from entering or exiting specific ports, airfields, or coastal areas belonging to, occupied by, or under the control of an enemy state. From that, we can glean that the U.S. is going to be targeting as many of Iran's ports in the Strait of Hormuz as possible, as well as coastal areas from which it can launch smaller boats. Bandar Abbas, which is located at the northern point of the Strait of Hormuz's large bend, is a likely target. The U.S. may also look to establish a naval presence around Hormuz Island and Larak Island, both of which Al Jazeera says act as gatekeepers for the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. may need to take those islands out of the equation, and it would likely strike them from the air, rather than run ground operations to do so. Asaloya, which is a key Iranian energy hub in the gateway to Iran's portion of the south, Pars gas field, is also likely to be attacked. The same goes for Karg Island, through which 90% of Iran's oil exports flow. Both of these locations lie deeper into the Strait of Hormuz, so a blockade of them can only realistically be carried out if the U.S. handles the other ports and islands closer to the strait's mouth first, that covers vessels that attempt to transit the strait from Iranian ports. Then there are the vessels coming from other Gulf nations that rely on the Strait of Hormuz. To consider, according to the New York Times, SANCOM has already declared that it won't impede the freedom of navigation for ships that attempt to travel through the Strait of Hormuz from non-Iranian ports. A big sigh of relief would have echoed through the rest of the Gulf region. At that news, however, James Krasker, who is a professor of international maritime law at the U.S. Naval War College, tells the New York Times that ships sailing from those nations aren't completely out of the woods. Krasker says that parties that are at war, which include both the U.S. and Iran, have the right to stop and inspect any private vessels passing through a neutral waters. The Strait of Hormuz fits that bill. So though the U.S. says that it will allow vessels from non-Iranian ports to pass, Iran could attempt a counter-blockade of its own to stop them from moving. The key takeaway here is that all of this is legal in a way that goes as much for Iran's blockade as it does for the one that the U.S. intends to implement. Both are classified as belligerents under international maritime law, and that classification is what leads them to being able to do what they're trying to do in the Strait of Hormuz. Every vessel that isn't operated by Iran or the U.S. is neutral, and thus may be subjected to stops and inspections. When sailing through the contested waters, legality may not be an issue for the U.S., but the real problem it'll face with this blockade is the Iran-sized elephant that is in the room. All we've spoken about so far assumes that the U.S. can pull off its blockade without a hitch. The warships will sail in, likely accompanied by aerial power, and they'll stop Iran from sending tankers and commercial vessels out from its ports. Simple yes, but not easy. The one thing this scenario overlooks is the fact that any warships at the U.S. stationed in the Strait of Hormuz make themselves targets for Iran. Slow-moving targets at that, as they'll be sticking close to Iran's ports. Iran has already highlighted the key challenge with that approach. When U.S. Navy ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz on April 11th, just a day before Trump announced the blockade, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, immediately started throwing around threats. A firm and forceful response was promised to any U.S. ships that tried to blockade the strait, and the IRGC also used Iranian media to claim that it forced the U.S. destroyers that had entered the Strait of Hormuz to turn around after it launched a drone in their direction. How true these claims are remain to be seen. But the one thing we do know is that Iran intends to turn the Strait of Hormuz into what Fortune dubs a kill box. The mines it's laid play a role in creating that box. Drones and fast boats will be problems for both the U.S. warships and commercial vessels that America allows to pass through the strait. Blockading Iran's ports may stop Iranian tankers in their tracks, but it does nothing to halt fast boats launching from tiny coastal ports or drones being fired from hidden locations. That's the big problem that the US has to solve. Its own warships have all of the defenses. They need to deal with these threats. But CENTCOM's promise to allow non-Iranian vessels to sail through the strait will ring hollow as long as Iran can use the same tactics that it's been using to blockade the strait. So far, one solution to this problem is to provide a warship escort for commercial tankers. That attempt to make the journey, that just creates another problem, as it would weaken the blockade of Iran's ports. That's without even considering the fact that an average of 138 ships traveled through the Strait of Hormuz per day before Operation Epic Fury. Even if the US does start providing escorts, that's a lot of ships to cover. Every day something might slip through the net. Just one successful Iranian strike against a commercial vessel could be enough to stop those commercial vessels from wanting to sail. Once more, the US blockade starts to look more like a gamble when we take these factors into account. But for the US, the payoff may be worth the risk. Stopping Iran's ships is the American priority, even ahead of ensuring safe transit for non-Iranian ships. If the US can do that for long enough, it believes it can remove Iran's leverage by forcing it to relinquish its hold over the Strait of Hormuz. How when Iran's oil tankers and commercial vessels aren't sailing, Iran's economy struggles. Iran has benefited massively from the spike in oil prices caused by its own blockade of the strait. According to Bloomberg, the regime has exported an average of 1.6 million barrels of oil per day between March 1st and 23rd, earning itself about $139 million per day in the process. With Iran in such dire economic strait, both before Operation Epic Fury and as a result of the damage that has been caused, since the US started attacking, that is money that the regime can't afford to lose. That's over $4 billion per month that slips away. If the US is successful in its blockade, this is where American pressure comes into play, as a naval blockade also means it no longer has to send ground forces into Iran. To put the economic squeeze on the country's regime, tankers that have been paying tolls to Iran, reputed to be upward of $2 million per ship, will also have no reason to pay that money. If the US is stopping them as soon as they exit the strait, there's no point in paying to make the journey in the first place. America's ultimate goal here is to shut the Iranian economy down, to the point where its regime has to negotiate. More pressure will be exerted until the US gets what it wants in the nuclear deal. If the US pulls this off, the tables will have been turned, but some problems may come out at the back end. A USLED blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is still a blockade. We're already seeing the impact. Oil prices surged past $103 per barrel. In the immediate aftermath of Trump's announcement, CNBC adds that China and India, both of which are major buyers of oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz, are going to reel from the aftershock of the US blockade. What the US intends to be a negotiating tactic could escalate into a froth of legal challenges and more fighting, especially when dealing with an ideological regime like Iran, for which standard, economic pressure may not be enough to force it to back down. Participation from others in the international community is also a key question. Trump has claimed that the US will have international partners helping with the blockade, though he hasn't said who those partners are. The UK has announced that it won't be one of them, so that's at least one country out of the running. So much about what we've heard is uncertain, but we'll soon see what the US has in mind for its blockade. There may even be an unexpected ally in the entire thing. Ukraine? Ukraine isn't going to be sending ships to help the US. It can't. The country barely has a navy, and what ships it does have are tied up in its war with Russia. But what Ukraine does have is drone expertise that could benefit the US. As it tries to deal with Iran's response to the American blockade, Ukraine is already providing that expertise to Gulf nations, and you can find out all about that by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the Military Show to see more of our analysis of the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, and thank you for watching.